Think of any video game franchise you enjoy. Why do you like it? The gameplay, graphics, or the story behind it? Of course, some games have incredible stories and massive amounts of lore behind them, but sometimes a simple video game can contain so much world building and awesome detail that is just so interesting. The 2006 video game Dead Rising is an example of this. For those you don't know, it's a survivor horror game set in the fictional semi-open world of the Willamette Parkview Mall in Willamette, Colorado. The main protagonist, photojournalist Frank West, is investigating a mysterious zombie outbreak in the town and must survive 72 hours in the zombie-infested mall while trying to uncover the truth and doing some side missions along the way. The game allows you to explore the giant shopping mall while using anything to survive the zombie outbreak: chainsaws, firearms, furniture, and more. Now, there's plenty of retrospectives, analysis videos, and reviews that touch on how detailed and awesome the mall is, as well as just praising the game for its unique gameplay and story. However, there's one concept that I see people touch on, but not a lot, and that's the psychopaths in the game. Now, the psychopaths are the bosses that the player can encounter within the mall. Some are mandatory for the story to continue, while others are completely optional. As we'll talk about this later in the video, there's a decent variety of them within the game. Some are just taking advantage of the situation, some are just trying to defend themselves, and others have had their psyche broken from the outbreak. From both a gameplay and storytelling mechanic, the psychopaths in the first Dead Rising are probably the best concept I've seen in any game like this, especially within the Dead Rising franchise. Even the name Psychopath catches your attention. This video isn't going to be a compare and contrast between all the psychopaths in the series. However, I might do another video on Dead Rising 2, so let me know what you guys think. But going back to Dead Rising 1, this video will explain why I believe the Dead Rising psychopaths are not only a great gameplay mechanic, but also a great storytelling one. And for reference and to avoid confusion, when I say Dead Rising, I'm referring to the first game in the franchise, not the entire series. This would be a long video, so I'll provide some chapters in the description, and let's just get to the main discussion. As I mentioned before, the psychopaths are main bosses within the game. Some are mandatory for the story, and others are optional. Most would be hostile to Frank once he stumbles upon their arena, and you'll have to deplete their health bar in order to defeat them. All of them have unique battle strategies and attacks to keep you on your toes. For example, Adam has multiple close-range attacks with his chainsaws, a mid-range attack with his throwing knives, a long-range attack with his balloon, and not to mention his counterattack. Cliff is more elusive, often retreating when he is hurt, and relying on his speed to ambush you with his machete. He also throws flares, which stun you, and grenades. Paul and the Hall family are more distant and will attack you when fleeing. Cletus is a powerhouse with his shotgun and will stay planted behind the counter. He'll also occasionally heal by drinking wine. Their strategies also reflect their personality. Cliff's battle style exhibits his guerrilla warfare strategies that he probably learned in his military experience. And Adam, as a clown, is flamboyant and indiscreet. These little touches in the battle dynamic really affects your strategy on how you approach them. I think the reason Adam is the most famous and role-like psychopath in the entire franchise is just that he's awesome. He has a unique theme and look, he's also versatile, and is also challenging to new players, being able to deflect and break melee weapons while also having a range of different attacks that can really make him a challenge, especially since he's one of the first psychopaths you'll meet in the game. That's probably why a lot of non-Dead Rising players, and even people who haven't played the game in years, recognize this boss fight. There are 18 psychopaths in the game, if you include the helicopter pilot, but we won't be mentioning him much. Of course, when you encounter some of these bosses on your first playthrough, you might be heavily outmatched by some of them, especially if you don't have the right items to face them. Some can unfortunately be taken out very easy by some weapons or using certain strategies, like the small chainsaw, the Mega Man Buster, or even the mannequin torso. But if you don't take them out within several seconds, you'll be treated to a unique soundtrack for most of the fights. The first Dead Rising has several composers and bands to create music for the fights. I really do enjoy most of these themes, especially since most of the later games would only have one or two composers to do the music. I really recommend some of these themes. I won't play most of them as I'm afraid of copyright, but I'll list my favorites. And I know I might sound like a lunatic or a psychopath myself, but I even listen to some of these tracks at the gym. It should also be said that the psychopaths are either triggered by scoops, which are optional side quests, or missions, and it is completely possible to skip one during the playthrough, and some will give you access to weapons after you defeat them. For those who haven't played the first Dead Horizon, here's a brief introduction to the Psychopaths, and most of these were analyzed deeper, and also slight spoilers for the game. We have Carlito and Isabella, the brother-sister combo who started the outbreak for revenge against the US government as they covered up a previous outbreak in their homeland. You fight Isabella once, but Carlito is fought 3 times during the story. The Convicts, probably the first optional psychopaths you'll encounter. These infamous prisoners commandeered a jeep and terrorized the park. Adam, a chainsaw-wielding clown that went insane from the outbreak. Cletus, a crazed gun shop owner who is extremely aggressive in defending his shop. Steven, the defensive manager of the supermarket. He's one of the mandatory bosses I mentioned. Cliff, a Vietnam War veteran who had his psyche break from the outbreak. Sean, the leader of the True Eye cult that appears in the mall. Kent, a pompous photographer who wishes to one-up Frank. The Hall family, 3 snipers that will shoot anything, zombie or human. Joe, a police officer who loves accosting young women. Paul, an arsonist who has taken out his anger. He can actually be saved by Frank and can later give the player an infinite amount of Molotovs. Larry, a butcher that seems unhinged and kidnaps Carlito, another story-based boss. Helicopter pilot, he's a pilot. And Brock, the leader of the special forces that invade the mall. He's the final boss of the game. Now that we've covered the gameplay side of the analysis, let's go into why the Psychopaths are great for the narrative side. Well, let's begin with the setting itself, the mall. Willamette has a population of 53,594, a pretty decently sized city, and with a mall this size, it makes sense that people would flock here for safety and supplies. Heck, several survivors have already done this by the time Frank shows up, and throughout the game, several survivors will barricade themselves within the shops and have a cache of food available. So it makes sense that the hostile survivors, the Psychopaths, will also do the same. One very cool detail is when the Psychopath is active in the area, zombies won't spawn, giving the impression that the Psychopaths are keeping the zombies at bay. For example, zombies won't spawn near the hardware shop in North Plaza when Cliff is active. When Adam has a space rider on overdrive, he keeps the zombies at bay. Joe won't have any near the storefront of her fight, and when the cult is active, the entire movie theater is used as their hideout, and don't worry, we'll get to the cult in a second. I know this detail is small, but it makes the game more immersive. Speaking of defending an area, I mentioned before that I categorize the Psychopaths into several groups. I begin with the first group, those who simply want to defend themselves. I consider Cletus and the snipers in this category. Both are extremely distrusting of people. Cletus, the distrustful owner of the hunting shack, will shoot anyone in sight, not willing to give people firearms. The Hall family has no qualms against firing on humans as they fire at Frank and the survivor Wayne. The second group are those who have already had their psyche broken. To me, this list contains Adam, Cliff, Steven, Larry, and possibly Paul. Now, I don't have a background or education in sociology or psychology, but I would imagine the zombie outbreak would drive some of these people over the edge. The third group are those taking advantage of the outbreak to fulfill their own wants and needs. This includes Joe, Sean, and the Convicts. And the final group are those who are just following their mission or just kind of dicks to begin with, like Kent, Carlito, Isabella, Brock, and the helicopter pilot. Regardless of their motivation, each psychopath piques your interest as you wonder, who are these people? Joe is probably just a mall cop who sees the outbreak as a chance to take advantage and fulfill her desires. Steven, Larry, and Cletus were probably just mall employees working at their shops. Adam was probably just an entertainer in Wonderland Plaza who snapped from seeing his clientele get devoured. The Hall family were probably just a standard Midwestern family, and Paul was just someone probably taking his anger out and needed to be shown one act of kindness to be snapped back to reality. And that's the thing, reality. All these characters are believable. These aren't epic characters like monsters or supervillains that you see in other games, and it helps that Frank himself is just a dude. Heck, most of the Psychopaths don't engage Frank until he does something to anger them. Adam engages him when Frank threatens to turn the Space Rider off, which would save Adam's prisoner Greg, but it would also bring the zombies back. Cliff attacks Frank when he hallucinates and believes him to be a wartime combatant. Steven attacks Frank thinking he's a shoplifter, and Paul attacks Frank thinking he's another bully. Kent's a bit iffy, we'll get to him later. Sean's the only one who commands his men to attack and kill Frank after Frank interrupts their sacrifice.
His blood must flow! He must be purged! Spill his blood! The blood of the heretic!
Joe and Larry are unique in the way that they won't even engage Frank until he attacks them. Joe would be fixated on her victims if Frank isn't actively attacking her. And Larry is also passive at the beginning of the fight, as he intends to sell Frank some meat. Another macabre realistic detail is when you're fighting the Hall family, whenever you kill a member, the other family members are screaming horror. Also, they will attack zombies, and zombies will feast on their corpse, so that's realistic and gruesome. And also harken on the reality aspect of the concept, the health bars and notebook entries list their real names. It would have been extremely easy to slap some health bar on the screen with some weird zany title, but I'm glad they didn't do that. Dead Rising, at least to my knowledge, is one of the first zombie video games, or even media in general, that have the concept of humans going rogue in a zombie outbreak. Afterwards, we would see this idea drilled into our minds in a lot of zombie media. And even here, it makes you hypothesize what these guys were like before the outbreak without spoon feeding you all the information. Now, since I don't really have a part in the script to fit this in, I guess I will quickly mention the main character psychopaths, Carlito, Isabella, and Brock. There's a few things I love about them. For starters, there are rumors that Carlito is actually the source that tipped off Frank to the incident, hoping he'll uncover the truth about the original Santa Cabeza outbreak. However, I have one issue with this theory, and that Carlito is very quick to attack and try and kill Frank, and even tries to blow up the mall when he's threatened.
That he'd blow up the mall if he were cornered.
Isabella isn't too in depth, her boss battle just comes from her not wanting to be confronted by Frank, as she initially helps Carlito. Brock and I guess the helicopter pilot may be seen as antagonists, but they're simply following orders to eliminate any survivors and zombies to contain the outbreak. I know it's still bad, but they see it as a necessary evil to stop the outbreak from spreading. Going off of the story, some of the psychos have minor subplots or stories within the game. For example, Ken has 2 missions before his fight, including a photography challenge between him and Frank. In the final Kent mission, he kidnaps a survivor and attempts to take a picture of the zombification process. However, Frank stops him, and then Kent turns a gun on Frank. But if Frank is late, an alternate fight breaks out, where Frank is stripped of his weapons and chained to the rafters. This information has nothing to do with storytelling. I just think it's awesome that this alternate fight exists. Some of the psychos even affect Frank's character. In the beginning of the game, Frank seems like some abrasive, hotshot journalist who just wants a big scoop.
Hey, we're not done talking yet. Hold your horses, babe. I'm the one asking the questions here. West, photojournalist. And right now, I'd rather have an explanation than your thanks, Brad.
Where did you take it?
You help me, I help you.
And later turns into someone who cares about exposing the truth of the outbreak and helping others. Kent is another photographer who is obsessed with his work, even to the point of killing and kidnapping people to achieve the best possible shot. After his defeat, he gives Frank his camera containing his film roll and implores Frank to take a picture, to which Frank defiantly throws and breaks Kent's camera. I don't know why, this is my second favorite death cutscene in the game, as A, I think it's just a badass Frank moment, and B, it's one of the moments where Frank realizes that getting the scoop isn't all that matters. In other death scenes, Frank will appear disgusted or appalled by the gore, which is realistic, but the one that tugs at my heartstrings is Cliff's death. When defeated, Cliff admits that he snapped when he heard his granddaughter scream. Frank would pity Cliff, and in a sign of respect, will shut his eyes, the only time he shows compassion for a psychopath. I believe some of these moments really impact Frank and develop his character throughout the game. Carlito's death also has an impact, for Frank promises on Carlito's grave to expose the truth about the Santa Cabeza outbreak.
But I promise, the Santa Cabeza story will be told.
He even wears Carlito's locket in future games, so I theorize that after Carlito's death, he had some respect and sympathy for Carlito, although still despises him in a way. These characters, although on the surface level appearing to just be a simple gimmick to add variety to the gameplay, really do impact the world building of the franchise and impact the main character. Speaking of which, another interesting gem is True Cole. These guys appear on the second day and are a separate enemy for Frank to fight. There's a very interesting video from Stipe on their development history, which I recommend, but these guys are creepy. They'll engage you if you get too close or attack them, but if you keep your distance, you get to see how unsettling they are as their prey while reciting their weird chants. There's so many of them, and you can spend so much time trying to figure out who or what these guys are. Was the cult established during the outbreak, with Sean just taking advantage of the situation? Were they already established and saw them all as a sanctuary? Another point I mentioned earlier is that Sean commands these guys to kill Frank, so they'll try to capture him sometimes to sacrifice him in one of the hideouts. Being captured by these guys is the only way to get to the storage room. Going back to the narrative aspect, their posters will be placed all throughout the mall. They'll even be posted before you officially meet them, which is pretty cool in my opinion, because it hypes them up, and they stay on the walls after their demise. The poster even states where their makeshift base is, the movie theater, and the screening room where you fight Sean. As already stated, the movie theater is void of zombies while they're active, and they reorganize the theater to have effigies, shrines, and torches. Again, the detail here is amazing. The cult isn't the only one to affect the environment. Cliff beheads and hangs zombie corpses in the hardware store, and these will remain after you defeat him. Even if you don't encounter him, the hardware store will still be this way, making the player ponder what happened here. Another example is the Space Rider, which will be in overdrive during Adam's fight, which is why Frank is called to investigate the plaza. They also affect the environment in the way that survivors will mention some of them. I'm not talking about the captured survivors after you rescue them from Psychopaths, but some mention them before you even fight them, which to my knowledge, no other Dead Rising game has done. For example, in the Scoop's Shadow in the North Plaza, you'll find a survivor named David barricaded in an empty shop. He's injured, and he'll mention the source of his wound came from some crazy guy at the supermarket. Obviously he's mentioning Steven, who was sticking to his gimmick of defending the supermarket from any shoplifters. Another scenario that doesn't get a lot of attention is Ross and Tanya's dialogue in the Scoop Lovers. Tanya mentioned Ross rescued her from someone and was injured in the process, and later, when you fight Joe, she'll say this:
"Looks like you lured another man in here, you little whore!"
implying that Frank isn't the first man to try to save the women. This leads me and some other people to believe that Ross rescued Tanya from Joe. This also works in reverse, as some psychopaths will reference survivors. For example, some theorize Cliff's granddaughter was Dakota from the intro cutscene. I'm not one of those people, but I think an argument can be made. The best example is when Kent shows several pictures of Frank when they first meet. All the pictures were taken at the entrance plaza. He pictures two women who appear to be Verlene and Dana, two survivors who were seen in the entrance plaza prologue and perished when the zombies invade the mall. Also, another picture shows the survivor Cheryl, who will later be captured by Sean. This implies several things. One, that more people such as Kent and Cheryl were hiding in the entrance plaza, and two, Cheryl survived the initial zombie break-in and vanished until being captured by Sean. It also makes you ponder who else was there and how they escaped. There's a lot of room for thinking here. Another area for discussion is the Convicts. Next to Adam, these guys are probably the most infamous boss in the game for several reasons. 1, they have a cool theme. 2, their Jeep and premise is pretty iconic. And 3, they respawn every night. A lot of people really bash these guys because of the respawning thing, but I don't mind it for several reasons. The first being that it shakes up things gameplay wise and keeps you on your toes. And second, it gives the impression that several convicts are running amok across Willamette. Again, it really makes you wonder what's happening in this town as you're just confined to the mall. And in conclusion, it's a really great criticism when you want to know more, but you're also content with what information you're given. Some of these guys, you don't really know much, but you can infer it from how they act and what they say. Thematically, it's really cool and sets the stage for future Dead Rising games so they can just ruin the entire concept. But that's a discussion for another day. For now, Dead Rising has the best bosses in any game I played because it's just so unique, from a gameplay and story perspective. And on the topic of the franchise, I might do more videos like this in the future, so let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like the video if you enjoyed my ramblings, and I will see you guys on the flip side.